Hey, good morning. How's everybody doing today? Dr. Chris Roddenberry coming to you live from Willow Springs, North Carolina on Thursday, September the 1st. Hope everybody's doing well today. Thanks for stopping into the broadcast. See, we have a couple of viewers here today. Don't forget this week your discussion board number 1 is due tonight. The final part of discussion board 1 is due tonight at 11:59 p.m. To receive full credit for this module's discussion board, you had to have made one original post, and then you have to respond to 2 other people. If you haven't started your discussion board post, you lost half credit for not making the initial post by last Thursday, but you can still earn half credit by making the initial post late and then making 2 more responses to your colleagues and classmates. Good morning, Angela Yang. Thanks for coming today. So today we are going to talk about biopsychology one more time. So yesterday I gave you a brief introduction to the organization of the nervous system from central to peripheral nervous system, and I talked about nerves and tracts. We then went in and talked specifically about about the building blocks of the nervous system. We talked about these things called neurons. And I suggested to you that these neurons work electrochemically. So chemicals called neurotransmitters are released in one part of your nervous system. They stimulate these neurons that then generate electricity that travels to another part of your brain and causes chemicals to be released in another part of your brain. And so different parts of your nervous system communicate with each other using this electrochemical method. But we were talking about the building blocks of the nervous system, how each and every individual neuron worked. What I'd like to do today is telescope back out for a little bit and talk about how these systems work together. So what I want to do this week is talk to you about the different areas of the brain and what they do. And I'm going to try to give you an appreciation for what I believe to be the 2 most important organizing principles of the brain, this idea of modularity and connectivity. So that's what we're going to talk about today. All right. So, oops, let's go ahead and switch to our screen here. 2 important organizing principles of the nervous system, modularity and connectivity. Best way to think about the nervous system. It's a bunch of modules, and each of these modules engages in its own simple activity, and then these modules then connect themselves in such a way that they can coordinate their simple behaviors to create more complex behaviors. Let's stop for a moment and talk a little bit about the modular theory of brain functioning. Good morning, Aubrey. Thanks for stopping in today. You and Angelina are my big audience today, and I appreciate you coming. So here's the deal. Once upon a time, people asked the question, does the brain just do one job at a time? All parts of the brain work together to do one thing. And does the brain just do one thing after another, after another, after another? Is the brain sort of like just a unitary machine that makes all kinds of different operations? Or is the brain a bunch of different computers, each engaging in a very simple task? All right. So people used to ask the question, do we need to think about the brain as one thing or as many things? Well, it turns out that in about the last 100 years, we've discovered that it is better to think of the brain as a bunch of modules, a bunch of small computers, with each of these computers engaging in a very simple behavior. So you don't have one unit that makes all your decisions and runs your body, sort of like a manager up top. Instead, you have all these little independent contractors who have learned how to do one small task. And when these tasks come together, they create complex behavior. So we can think of the brain as being a bunch of modules. In fact, most of your bodily processes are so complex that they are broken down into subtasks and processed in multiple areas. So if you were in webinar last weekend, we talked about vision, and I suggested to you that we could discover that vision is actually broken down into subtasks, looking at people who have disorders related to vision. I think I showed you the people who have visual agnosia and could see lines and shapes but couldn't actually see objects. Then there was somebody who had prosopagnosia. They could see faces, but they didn't recognize them as being family members. And I talked to you about how vision is actually several subtasks that are put together into a larger, more complex task. Now, if you look at this picture right underneath me, you'll see this crazy looking picture of the brain with lots of different colors and splotches on them. Now, this was a map of the cerebral cortex made by a fellow named Corbinian Brodmann over 100 years ago. What he did was he went in with his microscope and he examined all the different parts of the brain, and he found that there were different organizational structures of cells and different kinds of cells in different parts of the brain. And so he identified the 52 different areas that you could visually see by looking at a brain with a microscope. And these are known as Brodmann areas. And what scientists have done over the last year is tried to figure out what each of these Brodmann areas does. And some of these Brodmann areas are we clearly know what function they control, and other Brodmann areas are still a bit of a mystery. Okay, now so that's the one principle. We have all these different computers in our mind. Now, computers in our brain that each engage in simple activities. Now, the thing is, these computers need to connect to one another. So the second, so that they can coordinate their behavior. And so if we're going to see vision, and it's lots of different things, so you see color over here, you see movement over here, you recognize the object over here. If you have 3 or 4 different areas that work on a same task, they need to be connected to one another. So the second great principle, I believe, of the nervous system is what we'll call connectivity. All right. So if you look down here at the brain, you'll see that this is an actual picture of a brain. You're looking at what's called a corona cut. So the person's face has been cut off. They're looking right at you, but you see halfway through the head. What you notice is that this brain area has this brain has two colors, sort of a browny gray color and an interior light white color. We're going to call the brown material on the outside, we're going to call that gray matter. And we're going to call the white matter on the white stuff in the middle, we're going to call that white matter. Now, interesting things. If you look at a neuron, remember we talked about neurons and I said they are these cell bodies and dendrites that are connected to long axons. Well, if you look at this brain with a microscope, what you're going to see is that one part of the neuron makes up the gray matter and another part of the neuron makes up the white matter. So on the outside of the brain, this gray matter, this thin area, this thin gray matter is composed of cell bodies and dendrites. And these are sort of the nucleus, the connections, the working areas of the brain. And extending from these gray areas is the part of the neuron we call the axon. And that's the part that runs through this white matter and connects to a different part of the brain. So you have this gray matter composed of cell bodies and dendrites, and then on the inside you have this white matter, which is nothing but fatty coated axons connecting one part of your brain to the other. Now, the memories, your abilities, your functions are actually contained in the gray matter on the outside. Damage to a specific area of gray matter may disrupt a memory or an ability that you have learned. So the gray matter is where your abilities are contained, and the white matter just represents connections between the different gray matter areas. Now, if you look right in the middle of this, you see, you'll notice two things about this brain. Number one, there's this big split going down the middle of the brain. You have a left hemisphere and you have a right hemisphere of your brain, and these two parts of your brain are largely separate. But you'll notice that right in the middle there is a band of white tissue that goes from the left side to the right side. That structure right there is called the corpus callosum, and it is the band of myelinated axons that connects the left side of your brain with the right side of your brain. Okay, so here's the idea of the brain. We have lots of different areas on the outside part of our brain in the gray matter. These Brodmann areas each control specific abilities and functions that our brain engages in. Okay, these gray matter areas, these Brodmann areas that are found on the outside of the cerebral cortex in the gray matter, are then connected to one another through axons that run through this white matter stuff. Okay, and so you have a left side of your cerebral cortex and you have a right side of your cerebral cortex, and they're connected by axons. And the axon band you see in the middle here is called the corpus callosum. And so every brain structure that you have a left one and you have a right one. So when we look at your cerebellum, you have a left half of your cerebellum and it's divided from your right half of your cerebellum. You'll have a left hippocampus responsible for memory, and you'll have a right hippocampus responsible for memory. So all of these brain structures have a left side and a right side. So you sort of have copies of each area of your brain. Okay, now, general note, take a look right here. This is what's known as a DTI image. And what they can do now is they can actually use the movement of water. They can measure the movement of water in your brain along these fatty coated axons, and they can actually map the connections in your brain. And it turns out, if you're looking, again, we're looking at the corona picture. Right underneath me is a DTI image of somebody who's looking right at you. Do you see the little red line going from left to right? That's your corpus callosum, but this time it's imaged with computers. Now, I showed you this because I want you to see that there are, you can only see two of the three, but there are three broad connections that occur in your brain. The first is from the left to the right half, and you'll see we have the corpus callosum at the top, and then that little red band of tissues right at the bottom of the picture, that's a structure called the pons. So you have a connection in the pons and one up there in the corpus callosum. And then what I want you to notice is that there are blue lines that appear to be running from top to bottom. And those are the axons that carry information from your brain out to the rest of your body. And if this person turned to the side, what you would see would be green lines that are going from the back of the one cerebral cortex to the other, to one hemisphere of the brain to the front of the hemisphere of the brain. So you have three broad kinds of connections in your brain. You have axons that run left to right, axons that run from top to bottom, and you have axons that run from front to back. And these are the three kinds of connections that you have among the different brain areas, the brain locations that we have. Okay, now one note, if we go back and look at these Brodmann areas right here, the crazy thing is some of these Brodmann areas don't appear to have any specific function. So if you get damage to your Broca's area, it will specifically disrupt your language ability because we know what Broca's area does. But there's a spot a little bit farther back. If you damage it, nothing will happen to the person. And so people used to think that you didn't use that part of the brain. Those brain are actual parts of the brain that don't appear to have any specific function are what we call association cortices. So when two senses want to work together, they associate in an association cortex. All right. So one part of my brain is responsible for seeing color, and another part of my brain is responsible for seeing lines and shape. If I'm going to figure out what it is I'm looking at, those two things have to connect and talk to one another. And that's what happens in your association cortices. So when we talk about vision in a couple of weeks, you're going to see that we have something called a primary visual center, okay, which has a function we can see. But then around that, you will see the book talks about a visual association cortex, which is the part of your brain where these basic sensory experiences are combined together so that you can so that these two parts of your brain can work together. So we have these things called association cortices. Now, and one final note about the connections in the brain. The connections that exist in the brain are innate to a degree and genetic to a degree. However, stimulating a brain causes neurons, the dendrites of neurons, to grow, and neuron areas can invade other areas if they need to. And so, what happens is if you are born missing a part of your brain that controls a body part, another part of your brain will take control of the body part that doesn't have a piece of brain using it. On the other hand, if you lose a body part, the part of the brain that controls that body part will find something else to do. So we sort of have this cool quality of your brain, which is that it will rewire itself in case of damage to the brain or damage to a body part, which renders it unusable. And so your brain is always finding a way to maximize its potential. So I'm missing an area. I'm born without an area responsible for helping me create language. Well, a part of my brain right beside that will take over that ability, and I'll grow up with normal language, even though I was born without the part of the brain that's supposed to control language. On the other hand, they did this really terrible research study where they mapped monkeys' fingers so they could find out which part of your brain was active when you moved your thumb, which part of your brain was active when you moved this finger, which part of the brain was active when they moved this finger, and this finger. And after mapping the monkey's brain, they cut one of those fingers off. And then they found that the part of the brain that controlled that missing finger, within about 15 minutes, it started controlling the next finger beside of it, right? So our brains really have this quality of plasticity. All right. So the two organizing principles: modularity. You have all these different brain parts that do individual functions, and these brain parts connect through these myelinated axons. Okay. Now, parts of your brain don't have any specific function. They're the workspace where two different senses and two different functions will combine to create complex behavior. And this brain is very flexible in its design, and it can rewire itself in response to damage. Yes, that is crazy, Angelina. Now, the way we learn about these different brains now, the way yeah, so what I'm going to do for the rest of this class is describe to you some of the different functions that occur in different parts of the brain. And we typically learn about functionality of brain parts through case studies involving people who suffer brain damage. All right. The most common way to learn about brain function is to study someone's case who has damage to a specific part of their brain and lost a specific functional ability. These time honored this time-honored research method is known as the lesioning study. So we look at somebody who has damage to part of their brain, we look at what they can't do, and then we make we make the decision about what function that part of the brain controls. If you look down here at the real brain in the bottom middle of the scheme, this slide, you see where it says brain lesions similar to the one Tan would have had. There was a fellow, Paul Broca, a very famous patient. I apologize. I apologize. My computer died on me. Just a minute. I didn't talk while I was off, so you didn't miss a thing. Now, if you look at that picture down there, this famous Paul Broca had a patient. He was a French doctor who had a patient whose major problem was he couldn't speak. In fact, the only word that this gentleman could say was the word tan. And so that became the nickname that Paul Broca used when he published articles about this patient. Now, when Tan died, Paul Broca did an autopsy and found a lesion right about where you see this lesion is down here. And so Paul Broca, this area became known as Broca's area, and we know that it is responsible for the creation of motor language. So when you form words and say sentences, your lips are being directed by Broca's area. And so there, if you Google non-fluent aphasia, aphasia is a language disorder. Okay, if you Google non-fluent aphasia, oh my goodness, hold on just a second. Let me write that word down. If you Google non-fluent aphasia, let's see. Oh, no, wrong one, sorry. Non-fluent aphasia. Non-fluent aphasia. Okay. If you Google non-fluent aphasia, you will actually see some case studies of people with this disorder. They've got damage to that part of your brain, and listen to them. And what you're going to see is that they have difficulty getting words out. It's like they're struggling to talk. Okay. Now, you know, the neat thing is, I don't know if I'm going to talk about it. Am I going to talk about it? My internet's being cranky today. The weird thing is, if you go back about 2 inches in the temporal lobe, there's a place called Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area. And that's your grammar center. And if you have damage to Wernicke's area, you'll be able to make words really easily, but they won't have any grammatical sense. If you want, I suggest that's called Wernicke's area. And the disorder is fluent aphasia. Actually, you'll probably find fluent aphasia to be even more shocking than someone with non-fluent aphasia. And we've learned that because of these lesioning studies. Now, next week, when we talk about sleep and changing levels of consciousness, we're going to be talking about EEG machines. And an EEG machine, has anyone out there ever had an EEG before? It's where they put those electrodes. I think they have like 19 of them, and they put them all over your head and measure the electrical output of the different areas of your brain. If you look down there in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, you'll see an EEG readout. Each of those little lines represents a different electrode placed on a different part of the brain. It turns out that your brain changes the type and amount of electrical activity it puts out depending upon lots of different factors. And what we're going to talk about next week are sleep studies. It turns out that as we sleep at night, our brain, the electrical activity in our brain changes in a very predictable fashion. When you pay attention, your brain is generating different activity than when you're just kind of relaxing and not paying attention to anything. So your brain's generating different electrical activity right now in class listening to me than it would be if you were just chilling out at the beach relaxing one day. And we also use EEGs for event-related potential studies. Uh, when people are surprised or upset or otherwise have an emotional response to a target, uh, even if they don't tell anybody this thing has surprised them, their brain, their body's electrical activity will tell on them. Event-related potentials are bursts of electrical activity that demonstrate that we've been surprised or seen something new. And so you're going to see people learning about how the electrical activity of the brain works with these EEG studies. Now, a nifty thing about these lesioning studies. It's unethical to lesion somebody permanently to study their brain, so you can't do that. But this new technology called a TMS, the transcranial magnetic stimulation device, allows you to temporarily to use magnets to temporarily disable a part of the brain. And so we can temporarily turn off parts of the brain and see what functions are lost. And this allows us to learn about what different parts of the brain do. And then with the advent of nuclear medicine and computers, we're now able to image inside living brains. And if you look way down at the bottom of this, the functional MRI, what this does is this measures the activity levels inside the different parts of your brain. So what they do is they inject you with a radioactive marker that binds to oxygen or glucose. And when cells are more active, they eat up oxygen and glucose. Those are kind of like the gasoline of a neuron cell. And so what they do is they put you in a machine and they measure where the glucose and oxygen are spiking in your brain. And you can actually give a person activities and then measure what part of their brain is active while they're doing different tasks. And these are all different ways that we can start to identify what different parts of the brain do. Now, what I'd like to do is spend the last 15 minutes in class going through sort of the easy stuff, what different parts of the brain can do. Once you understand this idea of connectivity and modularity, right, this idea of plasticity, then really it's just a matter of knowing which parts of the brain do what. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through and point out some of the different parts of the brain. Now I'm going to use these terms hindbrain, midbrain, and forebrain. And those terms are simply used to characterize the evolutionary age of these different parts of the brain. Now, if you look at humans and compare them with frogs or mice, what you're going to see is that human brains are much bigger than frog brains. Now, but there's a more important difference. The difference between a human brain and a frog brain isn't that we have the same structures and they're bigger. What you will see has happened is we've added more brain structures that the frog doesn't have. So the frog has a part of its heart, a part of its nervous system that helps its heart beat. We have that same. I am so sorry. I'm not sure what's going on with my internet. But so hindbrain, midbrain, and forebrain are ways of talking about how the brain structures evolve, which ones are oldest, which ones are newest. And what you're going to find is that the older parts of the brain are going to control activities that you and the frog or the reptile share in common. And as we move up to the forebrain structures, you're going to see that these brain structures are only possessed by more evolved animals. And then there's a part of the forebrain that's larger in humans than it is in most other mammals. And so, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the brain, pointing out different areas. We're going to talk about the hindbrain, which controls the basic biological processes of the organism, sort of your reptilian brain, if you will. And then we have your midbrain, which is going to kind of control circadian rhythms and connect your sensory experiences to your consciousness. And then we're going to talk about the forebrain, which is the part of the brain that controls those functions that make you uniquely mammalian and uniquely human. Okay? So, in the hindbrain is a very, very back part of your brain, right on top of your brain stem and your spinal cord. It contains two structures that are important. Your pons, which is important for sleeping and waking. All right. Your pons actually paralyzes your body while you're dreaming in REM sleep so that you don't thrash out and hurt anybody. So, your pons is for sleeping and arousal. And right beside that is this structure called the medulla, which is responsible for breathing and heart rate. So, people who take dangerous drugs like heroin and overdose on it, what happens is the drug, it shuts down that part of the person's brain from working. It stops your heart and lungs from breathing and kills you. So you've got your pons and medulla. They control basic biological functions. They're part of your reptilian brain. Now, one other structure that you'll see in your hindbrain is called the cerebellum. And this is very important for the organism's ability to move its limbs together and move in an agile way around the world. If you think about it, all of your different body parts have to work in perfect unison in order for you to walk, to dance, to run, to drive a car. Any organism that motivates uh, around a changing environment and can run and jump and fly has to be able to coordinate their body parts movements very carefully. The cerebellum is the part of your brain that is responsible for this coordination and also your sense of balance. Damage to the cerebellum will make it difficult for you to walk. And you'll see people who have weird behavioral mannerisms when they walk. Sometimes this occurs because these people have damage to their cerebellum. Okay? Now, in the midbrain, right above that are a couple of structures that are typically referred to as the basal ganglia and the substantia nigra. These are newer than the hindbrain, and they are responsible for controlling your arousal and coordinating your behaviors and uh, and uh, yeah, in coordinating your behaviors. So the structure that we're going to talk about that's in your textbook that we're going to talk about, we're not going to talk about the basal ganglia, although they are very interesting. If anybody's ever heard of Tourette syndrome, it's due to a malfunctioning in the basal ganglia, which causes you to not be able to control yourself. But your book's going to talk about the substantia nigra. Your substantia nigra is important for reward and movement. So it's where you initiate and initiate behavior. So it's important in the reward pathway that we have in our brain, and it helps us initiate behaviors. Now, an interesting thing about the substantia nigra, it's where dopamine is synthesized in your body. It's where dopamine is produced in your brain. People with Parkinson's disorder have cell death in the substantia nigra, which decreases the amount of dopamine that their brain is making. And so, death of the cell tissue in the substantia nigra is associated with Parkinson's disease. Okay. Now, let's talk a little bit about this newest part of your brain called the forebrain. And these are the neural structures that are responsible for memory, emotion, conscious behavior, and thoughtful behavior. Okay, now we can think of these. You've got sort of your forebrain is going to be that part of the brain that we all think about, that wrinkly part. That's what we call the cerebral cortex. Okay, but then there are some structures that sit right underneath that that are really evolutionarily pretty new, and we're going to call those subcortical forebrain structures. So you've got your cerebral cortex, which is that wrinkly part. Down here in that picture, it's that light blue part, that wrinkly part. But right underneath that, there are some structures that work closely with the cerebral cortex to produce your conscious behavior. Those are called subcortical forebrain structures. Okay, now the first one I want to talk about is the thalamus. It's that blue structure right underneath the brain, and that's a sensory gateway for sight, sound, touch, and taste. All of your senses, with the exception of smell, are processed through the thalamus. The thalamus ties your vision to all of your other senses. So when I hear a sound, I know my eyes know to go over here because that's where the sound is coming from. The connection, the coordination between my different senses is organized by the thalamus. It's the sensory gateway of your brain. Now, when we get to chapter 7, we're going to talk about memory. And the hippocampus is very important for storing memories. Memories aren't actually contained there, but they must be processed by that brain structure in order to be stored in your temporal lobes. And the weird thing is, I've got a case I can show you when we get to chapter 7. There is a story of a man who had whose hippocampus was destroyed by a virus, and when that guy woke up, he had a 7-second memory. He could not learn anything new. Nothing you could tell him would last in his mind for more than 7 seconds. They called him the man with the 7-second memory. So you could tell him who you were. 7 seconds later, he wouldn't know that he'd even seen you before. But the hippocampus stores memories on a part of your brain we're going to be talking about in just a second. Okay? This is annoying. Now, tied to your hippocampus is your amygdala. Your amygdala is your emotional center. This is where you have the fight or flight response. When something scares you, when something makes you, something attracts you, your amygdala is the emotional center, right? Isn't that wild, Aubrey? That could possibly happen. If you want, you can Google the man with the 7-second memory. It's a crazy YouTube video. But attached to your hippocampus is your amygdala. It's your basic emotional center where your fight or flight response is generated. It's the part of your brain that's activated when you see something you really find attractive. It's the part of your brain that's first activated when you see something that scares you. It's your basic emotional center. Now, if you'll notice, your amygdala is attached to your hippocampus. Why might that be the case? Well, if you think about it, we use emotions to mark things that we need to remember. There are lots of things you see every day that you don't remember. Instead, we only remember those things that scare us or make us laugh or we find really, really attractive for one reason or another. So you can think about your emotions as sort of being a tag that your memory uses to decide what it's going to remember. Okay? And then the hypothalamus. Your hypothalamus is like the thermostat that keeps your system running at a set homeostatic level. Your hypothalamus keeps your body temperature at 98.6 degrees. Your hypothalamus tells you when you are hungry, your blood sugar is low, and you need more food. Your hypothalamus tells you when your water level is too low and you need to have a drink. Your hypothalamus tells you when you are sexually excited and want to find a partner. Your hypothalamus is sort of the seat of all of your motivated behaviors. If you can get in trouble for doing it too much and go to rehab, it's probably controlled by your hypothalamus. And so these are the different brain structures. Now remember, like I said, connectivity means that all of these different areas at some point or another work together. And there are pathways that connect these different brain areas that allow them to work together. Like I just suggested to you with the amygdala and the hippocampus, they are actually have connections that go between the two of them that allow them to work well together. Okay. Now let's talk briefly about the cerebral cortex, this outside top part of your body. Now, I'm going through all of these different brain areas, and I'm hoping you'll know them for the second exam, or for the first exam. It may seem a little confusing. I'm throwing all these different brain areas at you. The cool thing is, by the end of the semester, we're going to go back in each chapter, we're going to talk about different brain areas in detail. So I'm giving you the overview right now and identifying all of these different brain areas, and it may seem overwhelming. But each chapter, we're going to take a few of these brain areas and talk about them in depth. And by the time you get to the end of this class, you will know what each and every one of these brain areas that I've talked about today does. You'll have a really good idea and you won't be able to forget them. Okay, now let's look at the brain here. This is your cerebral cortex, this wrinkled part of your brain. This is what most people think of when they think of a brain. They don't think about the brain stem and the subcortical stuff. They think about this wrinkled structure right here on top of your head. Now, I already told you that your wrinkled structure has a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. It has a left side and a right side, and these two sides are completely independent except for that one connection called the corpus callosum. Now, the neat thing is, if you go in and look at each of these hemispheres, you're going to find that they have lots of little wrinkles on the outside. Those are called sulci and gyri. Your little gyri are the creases are the sulci, and you have gyri. So you have these little wrinkles on your brain. But what you're going to notice is that there are four really large crevices in each hemisphere that divide the hemisphere into four further parts we'll call lobes. So there's a big crevice that goes right down the middle of your cerebral cortex that allows you to separate out a frontal lobe from the rest of your brain. There's then also a deep crevice that goes this way that allows you to separate this lower temporal lobe from the frontal lobe, all right? And then if you go on the inside of this brain, on the very inside, there's another crevice that separates the occipital lobe from the rest of the brain. And so if you look, these crevices, the central fissure, the transverse fissure, the calcarine fissure, these fissures divide the brain into four lobes: a frontal lobe, a temporal lobe, a parietal lobe on the back, the top and back, and then at the very, very back, an occipital lobe. Do you see that? Okay. And I apologize. I am not sure what my internet is doing here today. Um, I got to find a new internet provider. Okay. So what I'd like for you to know over the course of this semester is we're going to know the different parts of the brain and what they do. Now, inside this thing called the frontal lobe, we're going to have three structures that I think are very important. The prefrontal cortex, this is the part that is biggest in the humans. And this here is responsible for personality and judgment and planning. And all of those devious, thoughtful things that human beings can do are controlled by the prefrontal cortex. Broca's area is the part of your brain that helps you produce language, okay? And then right behind that, there's this thing called the motor cortex at the very back of your frontal lobe. And on this motor cortex is a map of every muscle in your body, every part of your body. And every time you move one part of your body, this part of your motor cortex becomes activated. So there's actually a map of your body on your motor cortex. And this is the part of your body that initiates your motor movements. Okay? Now, you then have this thing called a temporal lobe. It's black on this first screen right here. And the temporal lobe has this thing called an auditory cortex, which is when you listen and noises first go in your ear, the first place they go to is to your primary or auditory cortex. See, it says primary, and that's because it has to find a way to associate in another area. We have primary cortices, and then we have association cortices. This is where the first processing of sound is done in your temporal lobe. And then your temporal lobe in general is where things go when you remember them. If you remember this lecture, if you remember what I'm saying, if you remember what your grandmother looks like, it's in your temporal lobe. And we actually have a very specific part in our temporal lobe called the fusiform gyrus. And it's responsible for helping us recognize faces. You ever notice how it's very easy to recognize faces, but you always forget people's names? It's not because you're bad at names, it's because you're super awesome at faces. And there are actually some people who have damage to this fusiform gyrus, and they develop something called prosopagnosia, which is face blindness. Face blindness. You can also YouTube search this and see some really cool videos about people who can't recognize faces. So that's your temporal lobe. Now your parietal lobe. In your parietal lobe, you have two things. Number one, right behind your motor cortex, in the front of your parietal lobe, is your primary somatosensory cortex. Whenever I touch part of your body, the corresponding part on the somatosensory cortex is going to become activated. So you have a map of all the spots on your body that you can feel, and that map is located in your somatosensory cortex. And then your parietal lobe in general is responsible for more complex thinking and also for spatial location. If you would, Aubrey and Angelina, I know you are sitting at a computer right now. Point to the direction where you think your car is parked. I can tell you I'm on the second floor and the front of my house is this way, so I know my car is down into the back of me. That's where my car is in a general way. I can't see my car, but I have a general idea of where I'm located in space, and so I can tell you where I think my car is. If you can do that, then your parietal cortex is working accurately. So this is where your map of where you are in space is. It's located in the parietal lobe, okay, your spatial orientation. And then if you were in webinar last week, we talked all about the occipital lobe, which is where your primary visual cortex is. You have a part of your brain that when you're looking at me, one part of your brain is diagnosing the color of my skin. What color does he look like? Another part of your primary visual cortex is looking at the lines that make up my face and evaluating them. Then another part of your primary visual cortex is looking at whether or not I'm moving or sitting still. And all those individual things are being processed separately in your primary visual cortex. And then right outside your primary visual cortex, these images are being put together to come to a unified picture of what it is you're looking at. So the color of what you're looking at is sent to this area. The lines that are sent of what you're looking at are sent to this area. The movement of this object are sent to this area. And in the association cortex, they are put together. And then you say, oh, wow, I see a person sitting in front of me. Then that information is sent to your temporal lobe, and you said, oh, yeah, I remember who that person is. That person is Dr. Roddenberry. And that's how you recognize me this morning using your visual memory. Okay? So on the exam, I know on the exam, I'm at least going to want you to know, you know what? When we get to the exam, we're going to have a review session, and I will tell you specifically what brain parts I'm going to want you to know for this exam. So be learning all these. Over the course of the semester, you will be forced to memorize all these, but I'm going to pick a subset of them and test you on that for the final exam. Okay? Motor and sensory cortex. Quick note about the motor and sensory cortex. So you'll see the motor cortex and the primary somatosensory cortex right here. One's in the frontal lobe, one's in the parietal lobe. If you'll see, they have a picture of a body that's drawn along the along each of these cortices. The idea is to show you that each part of the body is mapped onto this cortex for the rest of your life. This is your thumb area. This is your finger area. This is your arm area. And what happens is as you move body parts or feel body parts, each of these areas is activated. Three notes that I want you to know before I let you go. Number one, contralateral design. The brain, in utero, the brain twists during about the 10th or 11th week of development and switches around. And it turns out when we're born, the right side of our brain controls the left side of our body and feels the left side of our body. And the left side of our brain controls the right side of our body and feels the right side of the body. This is called a contralateral design. And it happens because the little brain twists during prenatal development. Just okay, contralateral design. Number two, the size of the area on the motor cortex is dependent upon the complexity of the body part, not how big the body part is. So you really don't have a whole lot of brain area for your trunk, the whole trunk of your body, but you have a lot of brain area for your lips. Well, your trunk just does this, it holds you up, but your lips do all kinds of crazy complex things. And so the size is not dependent upon the size of the body area, but how functional, how much stuff is being done by that particular body part. And as I said, plasticity. If you lose a body part, that brain area will find another body part to work with. On the other hand, if you lose a part of your motor somatosensory cortex, another part of it will change and start taking over the function of the body part that doesn't have a piece of brain. Okay, that's all I had to say today. Holy cow, that's a lot of stuff to try to get done in 2 hours of class. I want to thank you for coming today, Angelina and Aubrey. I really appreciate your attendance and your questions. Do y'all have any questions, anything I can answer? Don't forget, do the final part of the discussion board tonight. If you've already done that and you've come to the webinar, then you are good for this week. Otherwise, don't forget to do that. If you have any questions, thank you very much, Angelina. If y'all have any questions, don't hesitate to send me a text or an email. Otherwise, I'm going to log off right now. Have a great weekend. I'll see you next Tuesday. Bye.